Forget it. Gary stretched. I had a quiet night. Mostly. Red Sligo was setting out, awakened by their talk. What do you mean, mostly? Jim hesitated, feeling puzzled. Well, I tell you the truth, I'm not sure whether I saw anything or not, but I sure thought I did. Anyway, it had me scared. What was it? Jim's like pulling on his pants, but his eyes were serious. A lion? No, it was a man on a horse. A tall man with a dead white face, like a skull. Gary shrugged sheepishly. Makes me sound like a fool, but I figured for a moment that I'd seen a ghost. Red Sligo was staring at him, and Jeter's face was dead white and his eyes were bulging. A ghost? He asked faintly. Did you say a ghost? Oh, shucks. Gary shrugged. There ain't no such thing, just some hombre on a big black horse passing through in the night. That was all. But believe me, seeing him in that lightning up on the hill like I did, it sure was scary. Toby Langer was getting up, and he too looked bothered. Sligo came up over the fire and sat down, his boots in hand. Reaching down, he pulled his sock around to get a hole away from his big toe. Then he put his foot in the wet boot and began to struggle with it. That horse now, Langer asked carefully, did it have a white star between the eyes? Gary was surprised. Why, yes, as a matter of fact, it did. You know him? Sligo let go of the boot and stomped his foot to settle in the boot. Yeah, a fellow we seen down the road a ways. Big black horse. Sligo and Langer walked away from the camp a ways and stood talking together. Jeter was worried. Jim could see that without half trying, and he studied the men thoughtfully. Jeter Dirksen was a small man, quiet, but inclined to be nervous. He had neither the strength nor the toughness of Sligo and Langer. If Gary learned anything about the cattle, it would be through his own investigation or from Jeter. And he was growing more and more curious. Yet if these were double-A cattle that had been stolen, why were they being driven away from toward the double-A ranch and rather than away from it? He realized suddenly he knew nothing at all about Red Sligo or his outfit, and it was time he made some inquiries. This double-A, he asked suddenly, you been riding them for long? Dirksen glanced at him up sharply and bent over his fire. Not long, he said. It's a Salt Creek outfit. Sligo Segundo. Believe me, I know you're a foreman. Gary suggested. I think this was the outfit, he said. Hombre name of Mart Ray. Ever heard of him? Jeter turned sharply as slopping coffee over the rim of the cup. It hissed in the fire, and both men looked around the camp. Jeter handed the cup up to Gary and studied him, searching his face. Then he admitted cautiously, yeah, Ray's the foreman. Ranch belongs to a syndicate out on the coast. You say you know him? Uh-huh. Used to ride with him. Langer and Sligo had walked back to the fire, and Dirksen poured coffee for him. Who was that you rode with? Sligo asked. Your boss, Martin Ray? Both men looked up sharply, and Sligo's face cleared, and he smiled. Say, that's why the name was familiar. You're that Jim Gary, son of old Steve Gary. Yeah, Mark told us about you. Langer chuckled suddenly. You're the scary one, huh? one of us keep out of trouble. Yeah, we heard about you. The contempt in his tone stiffened Jim's back, and for an instant he was on the verge of a harsh retort. And the memory of what had lay behind him welled up within, and he bitterly kept his mouth shut. If he got on the prod and killed a man here, he would only have to drift farther, and there was only one solution, and that was to avoid trouble. Yet irritating as it was to be considered as lacking in courage, Langer's remark let him know that the story of his fights had not preceded him. "There's no call," he said after a minute, "to go around the country killing folks. If people would just get the idea they can get along without all that. Me, I don't believe in fighting." Langer chuckled, but Slager said nothing. And Dirksen glanced at him sympathetically. All the day the herd moved steadily west, but now Gary noticed a change, for the others were growing more watchful as the day progressed. Their eyes continued to search the surrounding hills, and they rode more warily, approaching any bit of cover. Once, when Jeter rode near him, the little man glanced across the herd at the other riders and said quietly, "That was no ghost you saw. Red rode up there on the hill, and there was tracks of a mighty big black horse." "Wonder why he didn't ride down in the camp," Jim speculated. "He sure enough saw the fire." Dirksen grunted. "If that hombre was the one Red thinks he is, he sure didn't have no aim to ride down there." Before Gary could question him further, Jeter rode off after a stray and, cutting him back into the herd, rode off farther ahead. Jim dropped down back to the drag, puzzling over this new angle. Who could this strange rider be? What did he want? Was he afraid of Swaggle? A big brindle steer was cutting wide of the herd, and Jim swung out to get him, but dashing toward the stream, the steer floundered in the water and into quicksand. Almost at once it was down, struggling madly, its eyes rolling. Jim swung a loop and dropped it over the steer's horns. If he could just give the steer a little help now, there was a chance he could get it out before it bogged in too deep. He started the buckskin back toward the more solid ground, and with the pull of the rope and the struggling steer, he'd soon had it out of the bank of the stream. The weary animal stumbled and went down, and shaking his loop loose, Gary swung his horse around to get the animal up. Something he saw on the flank made him swing it down beside the steer. Curiously, he bent over the brand. It had been marked over. The double A had been burned on over a /4. Something wrong? The voice was cold and level, and Jim Gary started guiltily turning. Then his eyes widened. Marked while crying out in the nighttime. I'm glad to see you. Ray stared. For the love of Pete, if it ain't Gary, say how you did get it here. Don't tell me you're driving that herd up ahead. That's right. Your outfit, ain't it? I hired on back down the line. This steer just got himself bogged down, and I had a heck of a time getting him out. You see Red and the boys? Not yet. I swung wide. Get that steer on his feet and we'll join him. Yet as they rode back, despite Ray's affability, Gary was disturbed. Something here was very wrong. This was a /4 steer with the brand worked over to a AA, and the brand for which Ray was foreman. If these cattle were rustled, then Mart Ray was party to it, and so were Schlegel, Langer, and Dirksen. And if he was caught with these men and cattle, so was he. He replied to Ray's questions as well as he could, and briefly aware that his friend was preoccupied and thinking of something else. Yet at the same time, he was pleased that Ray asked him no questions about his reasons for leaving home. Mart Ray rode up ahead and joined Schlegel, and he could see the two men riding on together, deep in conversation. When they bedded down for the night, there had been no further chance to talk to him, and Gary was just as well satisfied, for there was much about this that he did not like. Nor was anything said about the midnight rider. When day broke, Mart Ray was gone. Rode on to Salt Creek, Red said. We'll see him there. He glanced at Jim, his eyes amused. He said to keep you on, that he was a top hand. Despite the compliment, Jim was nettled. What else had Ray told of Schlegel? His eyes narrowed. Whatever it was, he was not staying on. He was going to get shut of this outfit just as fast as he could. All he wanted was his time. Yet by midday, he had not brought himself to ask for it. Dirksen had grown increasingly silent, and he avoided Schlegel and Langer. Watching him, Jim was puzzled by the man, but could find a reason for his behavior unless the man was frightened by something. Finally, Jim pulled up alongside Jeter. The man glanced at him and shook his head. I don't like this. Not even a little. She's too quiet. Gary hesitated, waiting for the cowhand to continue, but he held his peace. Finally, Gary said, speaking slowly, It is mighty quiet, but I see nothing wrong with that. I'm not hunting trouble. Trouble, Jeter said dryly, comes sometimes whether you hunt it or not. If anything breaks around this herd, take my advice and don't ask no questions. Just scatter dust out of here. Why are you warning me? Gary asked. Jeter shrugged. You seem like a right nice feller, he said quietly. Shame for you to get rung on something as dirty as this when you had nothing to do with it. Despite his questions, Jeter would say no more, and finally Gary dropped back to the drag. There was little dust because of the rains, but the drag was a rough deal, for the herd was tired and the cattle kept lagging back. Langer and Schlegel, Jim observed, spent more time watching the hills than the cattle. Obviously both of them were jumpy as Dirksen and were expecting something. Toward dusk, Red left the herd and rode up a canyon in the hills. Schlegel was still gone, and Jim was squatting by the fire watching Jeter slow throw grub together, and there was a sudden shot from the hills to the north. Langer stopped his nervous pacing and faced the direction of the shot, his hand on his gun. Jim Gary got slowly to his feet, and he saw that Jeter's knuckles gripping the frying pan were white and hard. Langer was first to relax. Red must have got him a turkey, he said. A few around here. He said earlier he sure likes them. Nevertheless, Gary noted that Langer kept back from his firelight, and he had his rifle near at hand. There was a sound of an approaching horse. And Langer slid his rifle across his knees. But it was Slagle. He swung down, glanced toward the big man. Shot at a turkey and missed, then he added, looking right at Langer. Nothing to worry about now. This is time for shore. Bergson got suddenly to his feet. I'm quitting, Red. I don't like this at all. Not none. I'm getting out. Slagle's eyes were flat and ugly. Sit down and shut up, Jeter, he said impatiently. Tomorrow's our last day. We'll have a payday this side of Salt Creek. And then if you want to blow, well, you can blow out of here. Gary looked up. I reckon you can have my time then, too, he said quietly. I'm heading west for Pleasant Valley. You? Langer snorted. Pleasant Valley? You better stay somewhere out where you can be took care of. They don't like side trouble out there. They don't sidestep trouble out there. Gary felt something rise within him, but he controlled his anger with an effort. I didn't ask you for any comment, Toby, he said quietly. I can take care of myself. Langer sneered. Why, you yaller skunk. I heard all about you. Just because your pappy was a fast man, you must think that folks are scared of you. You're yaller as saffron. You ain't ducking trouble. You're just scared. Gary was on his feet, his face white. All you gotta do, Toby, is if you want to lose some teeth, is to stand up. What? Langer leaped to his feet. Why, you dirty... Jim Gary threw a roundhouse left. The punch was wide, but it came fast. And Lank was not expecting Jim to fight. Too late, he tried to duck, but the fist caught him on the nose, smashing it and showering in the front of his shirt with gore. The big man was tough, and he sprang in, swinging with both hands. Gary stood his ground and began to fire punches with both fists. For a full minute, the two big men stood toe-to-toe and slugged wickedly, and then Gary deliberately gave ground. Overeager, Langer leapt after him. And Gary brought up a wicked right that stood Toby on his boot toes, and then a looping left that knocked him under the fire. With a cry, he leapt from the flames, his shirt smoking. Ruthlessly, Gary grabbed him by the front shirt and jerked him into a right hand to the stomach and then the right to his head. And shoving him away, he split his ear with another looping left, smashing it like an overripe tomato. Langer went down in a heap. Red Slagle made no move to interfere, but his eyes were hard and curious as he stared up to Gary. Now where, he said, did Ray get the idea you wouldn't fight? Gary spilled water from a canteen over his bloody knuckles. Maybe just figured wrong. Some folks don't like trouble. That don't mean they won't fight when they have to. Langer pulled himself drunkenly to his feet and staggered toward the creek. Red measured with careful eyes. What would you do, he asked suddenly, if Langer reached for a gun? Gary turned his level green eyes toward Slagle. Well, I reckon I'd have to kill him, he said matter-of-factly. I hope he ain't so foolish. Dawn broke cold and gray, and Jim Gary walked his horse up into the hills, and when he heard the shot the night before, he knew that if Slagle saw him, there would be trouble, but there was much he wanted to know. Despite the light fall of rain the night before, there were still tracks. He followed those of Slagle Bay when he found where they had joined those of a larger horse. Walking the buckskin warily, Jim followed the trail. It came to a sudden end. A horse was sprawled in the clearing, shot through the head. A dozen feet away lay an old man, a tall old man, his sightless eyes staring toward lower skies, his arms flung wide. Jim bent over him, saw that he had been shot 3 times through the chest. 3 times. And the wound lower down was an older wound, several days old at least. The horse wore a slashed war brand. Things were beginning to make sense now. Going through the old man's pockets, Jim found an envelope containing some tallies of cattle. And the envelope was addressed to Tom Blaze, Durango, Colorado. Tom Blaze? The /4.